When you look into a manger, what do you see? Do you see a child or do you see a king? I think it's important to know the difference, and it's important to not just see a child, but also to see a king. We've been talking about the good news of Christmas, and the good news of Christmas is not just that a child was born in Bethlehem, but here's the good news, that on Christmas, a king was born. That's incredibly good news. And so one of the things I want to ask you to do over just the next few moments and the next few hours as we celebrate the birth of Jesus is that when you look into the manger, don't just see a child, see a king. And it's an important distinction because when we only see him as a child, you know this child eventually grows up, right? And he becomes Jesus. He walks through and becomes this great teacher and miracle worker. He gives his life. We know all of that, but I think too many of us keep him in the manger and forget that he also sits on a throne. The good news of Christmas is that on Christmas a king was born. And when you only see a child, eventually what your faith turns into is that man Jesus is nothing more than a man-child. You know what I'm talking about when I say man-child? You know what a man-child is? A man-child is essentially what Will Ferrell does in every single one of his movies. A man-child is a grown-up man who acts like a child. And it's hilarious, it's funny, it's cute, but it's hard to take serious. And some of us, we view Jesus like Will Ferrell in Elf, for example, where he is a man-child. Elf is one of my favorite Christmas movies because it's funny, and the reason it's funny is because Will Ferrell is a grown-up with all of this body hair and all this age and all this height, but he's like a little baby kind of. And some of us, because we only view Jesus in the Christmas season as a child, we view him like we view the elf. We see Jesus grow up and we just think he's just a nice guy. I love smiling. Or we view Jesus walking around the nation of Israel like, I'm singing, I'm in Israel and I'm singing. And everybody who's around Jesus is just looking at him saying, bye Jesus, I hope you find your dad. That's how often we view Jesus. And when you just see a child in the manger, eventually he grows up just to be a man-child. And while man-child is funny, cute, they're incredibly hard to take serious. And Jesus was someone who was meant to be taken serious. And so one of the things I want to invite you to is to see Jesus, how the Bible views Jesus. And they view him, especially in the Christmas season, as more than just a child in a manger. Sure, that's the reality, the physical nature of what's happening, but there's something deeper happening in that moment. So what I want to do is just real quick, take you on a journey through the scriptures of who this child is. And I want you to see that when the scriptures, when the Bible talk about Christmas, when they talk about Jesus, they're not just talking about a baby. They're talking about a king, because that's the good news, that on Christmas, a king was born. Let's start 700 years before the very first Christmas. 700 years, a king was foretold in the book of Micah, when one of the prophets of Israel, Micah, says this to the city of Bethlehem. You, O Bethlehem, Ephrathah, are only a small village among all the people of Judah. Yet, a ruler of Israel whose origins are in the distant past will come from you on my behalf. 700 years before Christmas Day, the people of Israel weren't promised a baby, they were promised a ruler. They were promised a king. Now you get to that first Christmas Day in the book of Matthew, and a king was foretold, but now we see that a king is discovered. A king is found in Matthew chapter 2. In the city of Bethlehem, the prophecy comes true, and it says that Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. Don't miss that a king is born in the middle of another king reigning. It says, during the reign of King Herod, and about that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, where is the newborn king of the Jews? Notice what they're not asking. They're not saying, where is this newborn baby? They're asking specifically, where is the newborn king of the Jews? King Herod was the king of the Jews. And now, in the middle of his reign, a newborn king has entered the picture. And it's a king who outranks any king that you follow. We go on throughout the Gospels and throughout the New Testament to see that this child eventually leaves the manger and leaves his hometown. He grows up. He does this amazing ministry. He begins to gather a whole bunch of followers, and he makes his way to Jerusalem, which is a big deal. Jerusalem is the capital of the nation. And they begin to ask themselves, could this be a king marching on the capital? And that's what they believe. And so in Luke chapter 19, they begin to follow him and sing his praises. It says, all of his followers began to shout and sing as they walked along, praising God for all the wonderful miracles that they had seen Jesus do. And they began to sing this song, blessings on the King who comes in the name of the Lord. When they looked at Jesus, they didn't see a child. They saw a king who comes in the name of the Lord. And when they looked at him, they're like, this is a king who is gonna give us what we want. Just a few days later, though, they find out that this is not a king who's just gonna give you what you want, but he's a king who's gonna give you what you need. And they're not happy about that. And so a king marches on the capital, is praised by the people, but then this king is rejected by them. In Matthew chapter 27, it says that the Roman soldiers stripped him, put a scarlet robe on him, they wove thorn branches into a crown and put that crown on his head. And they placed a reed stick in his right hand. Then they knelt before him in mockery and taunted, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then they led him away to be crucified. When this king doesn't give them what they want, but gives them what they need, they crucify him and kill him, because that's not the kind of king that they wanted. You guys know the story, and it's not Easter season, but we're gonna go into Easter real quick if that's okay. This king, he dies on the cross, he's put in the grave, he raises from the dead. Now we celebrate Easter season. But after his resurrection, it's important to know where he goes. He doesn't go back to the manger, he doesn't go back to Bethlehem, he goes to sit at the right hand of his Father. And he sits at the right hand of his Father on a throne as the king over all creation. So you wanna know where our king is today. He's not in a manger. Right now he sits on a throne reigning over all of creation. And that's why in the book of Colossians, we're able to read this, where the Apostle Paul tells the church, since you have been raised to new life with Christ, set your sight on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits in the place of honor at God's right hand. Get your eyes off the manger and set your eyes into heaven and see where he sits now. There's good news. It was a king who was born, and now he sits on his throne. And that's where he is today. One of the things I love about the Bible is it doesn't stop with today, but we get a little peek at what's to come. In the book of Revelation, chapter 19, we see that not only has a king come, but a king is coming again. In Revelation chapter 19, it talks about this king coming on this white horse when it says that the writer John sees heaven opened and a white horse standing there, and its rider was named Faithful and True, because that's who Jesus is. He's faithful and he's true. And it says he judges fairly and wages a righteous war. His eyes were like flames of fire, and on his head were many crowns. On his robe at his thigh was written a title, King of all kings and Lord of all lords. And what we see that Jesus is no longer a child in a manger, he's a king reigning in power from a throne that he came once and he's coming again. The good news of Christmas is this. On Christmas, a king was born. And this Christmas, a king reigns. And someday, this king is coming again. Now, you may be asking this question, why is it important to know that he is a king? Can't we just have our moment? Like, it's Christmas. Can't we just leave him in the manger, the cute little baby in our nativity set? Can't we just be okay with him being a child? Well, I think it's important to know that he's more than a child and he's king because of this fact. A child must be parented, but a king must be obeyed. And unfortunately, what I think many of us do is we still view Jesus like a child. Yes, he's grown up, but he's still our child. that we've got to care for. And a child must be parented. And I think maybe that's how some of us approach Jesus. Like, he is still a child that needs to be parented. What do you do with a child? You tell a child what your child needs to do, how they do it. You teach them to do it the way that you want it. And if they don't do it that way, you ground them. Tell me some of us haven't done that with Jesus. Tell me that's not how we pray to Jesus sometimes. Jesus, here's what I need you to do. Here's when I need you to do it by. And if you don't do it the way that I want you to do it, then you're grounded from my life. I'm gonna leave you and separate from you. Why do we approach him that way? Because I think we might assume that he's a man-child. But you know what he is? He's a king. And there's no way you approach a king that way. Can you imagine going to a king who has all authority, all power, reigns sovereignly, and you telling him what he should do? You don't approach a king. What you do towards a king is you obey a king. But if we're honest, I think most of us would say this: we don't want a king. We're not interested in kings. We're good Americans. We left that behind 250 years ago, right? Because we want to rule ourselves. We want to sit on our throne. We want to make the decisions, and we want things to be done like we would do them. And so we don't really want a king. But here's what we need to know this Christmas: that Jesus would much rather you obey him than celebrate his birthday. I think we can do both, by the way. I think you can do both. And I think it's worth us celebrating his birthday. In fact, here's what we're going to do. We're going to sing another song in celebration of who he is, but it's an interesting Christmas song that's called Manger Throne. And I think that's a great perspective to carry into this Christmas. Because I do think it's important to see a child in the manger, but we have to understand what the manger is or where this child is going. He's going towards a throne because on Christmas a king was born. And so why do we celebrate the birth of this child? I think this is the importance of Christmas. That how Jesus was born tells us what kind of king he will be. How Jesus is born tells us what kind of king he will be. You know, most kings, they're born in palaces. They're born into privilege. Jesus, his birth tells us a different story about what kind of king he's gonna be. I know you don't want a king for rightful reasons. Most kings, they're pompous, they're narcissistic. Most kings are self-interested, they're self-indulging. Most kings, they grab for power, they protect themselves, and they use people to do it. I understand why you would push back against having a king. But how Jesus was born tells us what kind of king he was gonna be. And I think the reason to look at the manger is not just to see a child, but to see what kind of king this child is gonna be. When you look at the manger, what do you see? When I look at the manger, it tells me that he's gonna be a humble king. When I look at the family that surrounds the manger, it tells me that he's going to draw in the weak, and he's gonna draw in the poor. When I think about the shepherds who draw around that manger, it tells me that the shepherds were ordinary, and that means that Jesus is gonna welcome the ordinary. And then when I think of the angels that surround that scene and are making the announcements of the birth, it tells me that he welcomes the ordinary, but there's nothing ordinary about him. But there's something extraordinary about him and supernatural about him. When I think on King Herod trembling at the news that a new king of the Jews has been born, it shows us that Jesus reigns above all kings, and kings bow down to him and they tremble in his presence, even when he was a child. And when I think about the Magi and the gifts that they bring, the Magi tell us that he's more than a baby, that this child is prophet, priest, and king. The good news of Christmas is that a king has been born. And if Jesus really is king, then there's only one response. It's to give him glory, to give him his due honor, to give him your life, and not just to give him your belief, but to give him your obedience, to give him your submission, to give him all things and surrender to him, knowing that this king is humble, this king cares, this king is not just for himself, but he's for all of us. And if he's king, then I must follow him. And that's why we can stand before him and say, Jesus, glory belongs to you alone, because you are the king reigning from a manger throne.